Call Shane Retick.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement Amendment Bill in its second reading. Its second reading, Mr Speaker, we listened to 85 submissions, or we had 85 submissions over the month of July. And when those were analysed, there were 4 themes for the submitters collectively. The first was around patents, the second was around copyright, the third was intellectual property, and the fourth was not intellectual property. Now, this bill itself makes changes to 11 acts, and I'm going to briefly mention them because I want to come back and pivot and focus on one particularly, which will address some of the concerns we've just heard a moment ago. The Tariff Act 1988 is what I actually want to focus on, but just so we can see the breadth of this bill, I want to mention the others as well. There's the Dairy Industry Restructuring Act 2001. This all deals to the goods parts of the bill. The Customs and Excise Act 1996. Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, again 1996, and Wine Regulations 2006. Under the investment umbrella, the Overseas Investment Act 2005 is amended by this bill. For Intellectual Property, Patents Act, we received a lot of submissions around patents. Agricultural Compounds and Veterinary Medicines Act, we didn't receive so many on that. Copyright Act, again maybe 30 to 40% of our time was around copyright. And the Trademark Act 2002. Transparency, we also had, this bill also deals to the Legislation Act 2012. Now I want to come back and focus particularly on the amendments this bill makes to the Tariffs Act. And I want to do that for several things, because I think this part of the bill does a lot of the heavy lifting in TPP. First of all, it sets the tariff rates, which I think clearly are very important. But I think what's also important for the Tariffs Act is it attends to some of the protection concerns that we've just heard from across the House. More specifically, it talks to the safeguard measures. And there are 2 safeguard measures that the TPP Amendment Bill looks to enact. The first is called the Transitional Safeguard Measure. And this is a measure that applies in the transitional period, which is the period from when the agreement comes into force for those goods that do not have an elimination schedule. It lasts for 3 years from when the goods come into effect. For those that do have an elimination schedule, the transition period lasts for the whole period of that transition. Now, over that time, if there is a threat of serious injury or a threat to serious injury to the domestic market, then there's the ability for the transitional safeguard measure to kick in. And if I can just talk to that measure a bit further here. The safeguard measure, the transitional safeguard measure, is for where individually goods are imported into a party's territory in such increased quantities, in absolute terms or relative to domestic production, and under such conditions as to cause or threaten to cause serious injury to the domestic industry that produces a like or directly competitive good. So there's a safeguard measure right there that we can bring in during this transitional period. And what is the nature of that measure? Well, what it lets us do for a period of 2 years, with an extension of 1 year, it lets us penalise those importers who may be bringing goods in that, as we could see here under this clause here, may unfairly compromise the domestic market. And what we can do is we can increase the customs rate as a penalty for those importers who may be harming our domestic market. It also talks to whether it's a threat to the domestic market. And that threat is detailed as a serious injury that on the basis of facts, not merely on allegation, conjecture or remote possibility, is clearly imminent. So the Tariffs Bill, amendment to the Tariffs Bill, gives us the ability to talk to the transitional safeguard measures. If our domestic market is being compromised by goods, we can bring in this measure, which is a 2-year compromise plus 1. The second safeguard measure that the Amendment Bill applies to the Tariffs Act is the emergency safeguard measure. Now, the emergency safeguard measure has similar verbiage to what the transitional safeguard measure had. That is, it applies when a good, in fact, this actually only applies to textiles, I'd add, to textiles, that if a good is imported in increased quantities in absolute terms or relative to domestic production, and under such conditions as to cause or threaten to cause serious injury to the domestic industry. Now, the emergency safeguard measure also has other clauses that fine-tune the eligibility for the safeguard measure to apply. And it's these measures here that are new. This is what the transitional safeguard measure doesn't have. That is, what must be taken into account is changes in such relevant economic variables as output, productivity, utilisation of capacity, inventories, market share, export, wages, employment, domestic prices, profits and investment. So where I'm hearing about protections from across the side of the House, here we are here specifically talking to that. Here's some of the protections that this amendment bill will bring into play. Now, the safeguard measure, the emergency safeguard measure, has a different time frame to the transitional safeguard measure. Again, I've mentioned that it applies to textiles and apparels, and the transition period is from entry into force until 5 years after the elimination of tariffs. So that's quite a long period where we can bring in this emergency safeguard measure. The nature of the measure? Well, what we can do here is we can raise the tariff level to disincentivise people who may be harming our domestic industry. What level can we raise it to? Well, we can actually raise it to the tariff levels that we have with most favoured nations. So there's very clear protection measures here into this, and this is what this bill actually brings into play. It enacts through the Tariffs Act. That's why I think this part of the 11 Acts is actually the one that's doing the heavy lifting. I think this is the one that gives us a lot of protections. If we were to apply the emergency safeguard measure, it's a measure that lasts for 2 years. And there's very strict protocols as to how we approach the importer who we think is harming our domestic market. They've got 60 days to respond. The nature that they respond, the allegations that are being made, the nature of the harm to the domestic industry are all discussed, all laid out, and then the local market can bring these safeguard measures into effect. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this bill is very important, even though we're not certain as to when TPP will be enacted, and I take that on board from our colleagues. It is useful, if or when it is, to have this ready to go. It's also been useful, as it always is at Select Committee, and I want to commend the Chair, Mark Mitchell, and my other colleagues for bringing this bill through and for doing such good work on this. It's also useful to have the advice from those out in the external industries, because they give us a lens that we don't see. We didn't see some of these things, certainly some of the details around technology protection measures. We really needed it explained. They're really very complex, and they're explained in great detail by several submitters, and we were eventually able to get our heads around what we're looking to do here. As I mentioned, there were 4 large areas that submitters talked to. They talked around patents, and we had a number of people from the performing industry, we had a number of authors, we had those from either side of the fence who argued both sides. And again, that's what Select Committee does. They argued both sides of that, and we were able to form a view that we're bringing forward to this House today. Similarly, from the Copyrights Act, we had a lot of impassioned pleas from people saying reduce it, expand it. We're sort of being consistent with the Americans, but we have a different view. And there was a lot of arguments around that. Again, we were able to crystallise that and bring that forward in a view that I think is well-reasoned. Joining both of those, the Patents Act and copyright, is intellectual property, and that sort of wove its way between both of those key themes. There was a smaller part, there were a number of parts of these bills that were not discussed. In fact, everyone was quite happy with the Tariffs Acts, but I've just talked about. There wasn't any specific recommendations to that, and in fact, probably 2/3 of the bills that we're looking to enable here, of the acts that we're looking to enable, were not actually spoken to by submitters. They were quite happy with that. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this amendment bill is very important. I think it does address the protections that the opposition have raised here. The 2 I've particularly spoken to under the Tariffs Act today, the transitional safeguard measure and the emergency safeguard measure, and I believe they do give us the protections that we're looking for, and I think this bill should proceed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.